Hello everybody and welcome to this special AQA A-Level Chemistry predictions video where I'm going to try to help you to prioritise your revision for paper 3. To do this, I've looked at what's come up on paper 1 and paper 2 already this year, and importantly, what hasn't come up yet. I've compared this with how important particular topics normally are across all the past papers that there have been, and I'm using this to inform my predictions about what I think is most likely to come up. Paper 3 does tend to have a practical focus, so I will definitely try to anticipate which required practicals feel more likely to come up and which ones you need to revise, and I'll finish by giving some advice about how to approach the multiple choice section of paper 3. This graph takes into account the number of marks that have been available for a particular topic on average across all of the papers for A-Level Chemistry and compares it to the number of marks that have been available so far on paper 1 and 2. And so when we are on the right-hand side of the graph, you'll find the topics that have been assessed a bit more than average already before paper 3 has even happened, which does suggest that they are unlikely to be a big focus of paper 3 because they've already been quite heavily assessed this year. And on the left-hand side, you'll find the topics that have been under-assessed so far and are therefore more likely to come up on paper 3 this year. And when we look at these topics, we see the rate equation, thermodynamics, equilibrium constant Kc, equilibrium constant Kp, aldehydes and ketones, amines, and energetics. These topics make up our top 7 and are a really good starting point in terms of working out your revision priorities. The topics in the middle are less likely to be a big focus of a question at the start of paper 3, and so therefore they are probably going to only show up on the multiple choice section, if at all. Looking at the physical chemistry topics, I think that there are a number of them that have been under-assessed this year. Starting with the rate equation topic. We had the Arrhenius equation on paper 2, so I think that's done and dusted, but determining the order with respect to a particular concentration of reactant, that's barely come up at all so far this year. And so I could see a big question being one of those for section A on paper 3. In addition to that, there are a number of required practicals that link to rate of reaction. We've got the disappearing cross experiment, the iodine clock experiment, and the reaction between magnesium and HCl, where you determine the initial rate of the reaction by collecting gas and working out the gradient of the tangent. And so we have a good deal of skills here, required practicals, graphing skills, and using data in the form of those equations. In the thermodynamics topic, that's been under-assessed this year. We've had some entropy and Gibbs free energy, but we haven't had anything to do with Born-Haber cycles at all. So there could be a Born-Haber cycle at the beginning of paper 3. I'm so surprised that there hasn't been any equilibrium constant calculation at all so far this year, neither Kc nor Kp. I'd anticipate one of those showing up alongside probably an organic chemistry question, because you could work out the equilibrium constant for, say, an esterification using Kc or a gas phase reaction using Kp. One of those surely would come up this year. In terms of energetics, there was no calorimetry so far on paper 2, and I would see that as one of the required practicals quite likely to come up, potentially linked to enthalpy of solution from the thermodynamics topic. So looking at dissolving different ionic compounds and anticipating which of those might have the largest lattice enthalpy to link it in with thermodynamics, but also to calculate an enthalpy change. Amount of substance has been assessed a little bit less than average. Probably this will be made up in the multiple choice section, but if I was to pick something in section A, I might say the volumetric solution required practical, because even though we've had a titration calculation, we've not had that part of the required practical. If we look at the organic chemistry, the topics that have been assessed the least compared to their average, in first position is aldehydes and ketones. So that is things like nucleophilic addition, testing for that functional group, reduction, and just general nomenclature and structure. That could come up this year. And then next in the list is amines. Amines, there has been nothing at all about amines, so possibly something about amines as bases or their preparation or just naming, potentially linking this with chromatography perhaps as a link to a practical topic or maybe links to an equilibrium. The third topic that's been under-assessed this year so far is halogenoalkanes. We've had a decent amount of free radical substitution, so there won't be anything to do with that, but we haven't had any nucleophilic substitution at all, or any nomenclature or isomerism to do with halogenoalkanes. So I could anticipate something to do with that. And then carboxylic acids and derivatives, we've had nucleophilic addition elimination as a mechanism, so I'm not expecting anything of that sort, but testing for carboxylic acids and esters and their hydrolysis, that's something that hasn't been assessed this year at all. And I've already mentioned that carboxylic acids and the esterification links to Kc very nicely. And finally, chromatography. It's a required practical. It doesn't get assessed that much on average, but we haven't had anything about that this year, so that's a potential required practical question. Inorganic chemistry has been pretty well catered to already on paper 1. The main topic that's not been assessed as much as normal is period 3 elements and their oxides. This doesn't really lend itself to paper 3 because it's not really a practical focus, but because it's been so under-assessed so far, I do fancy it for a small question on paper 3. It could be made larger by linking it to required practical 4, so that's the chemical testing for positive and negative ions. It would be pretty easy to make them positive and negative ions of period 3 elements. Required practical 11, that's a transition metal testing. I think that was covered enough on paper 1 to suggest that that's not likely to come up on paper 3. If we take a detailed look at the required practicals that could come up and then narrow this list down, first of all, required practical 1, I think making up a volumetric solution. There's some method questions that could go into that. Titrations, I would say likely done and dusted on paper 1. I've already said that enthalpy change, so calorimetry, potentially linking that to the combustion of a fuel or the dissolving of an ionic compound would be one of my anticipated questions. And then required practical 3, tied with required practical 7, I actually think that's the most likely to come up because of how little of the rate of reaction topic we've had so far. You could link 3 and 7 to the rate equation topic, so that would be my number 1 prediction. Required practical 4, it's quite a short required practical, could come up, I've already said linking that in with period 3 elements and their oxides. Distillation of a product from a reaction. We've had a big question about organic preparations, but not really anything to do with distillation or reflux. So that's possibly almost an outside bet. We've had some organic testing, but not much. That could easily be woven in as a very small part to almost any organic chemistry question. I think we've had plenty of electrochemistry, so required practical 8 is not likely to be a priority. Similarly, I don't think 9 is a priority. We've had quite a bit of acids and bases, and we had a pH curve question on paper 1. Required practical 10 we had loads of on paper 2, so I expect that's done and dusted. The only bit really not covered there is reflux, so could be a short question about reflux or distillation. RP11, I think that was done, and we've had lots of transition metals so far already, so I'd say that that is less likely to come up. And thin layer chromatography, we've not had tons of stuff on amino acids. We had a little bit on paper 2, but we could have a bit more from a chromatography point of view, perhaps. There are 30 multiple choice questions that could come up on paper 3, and they're often a little bit random, the odd mark here and there, but sometimes there are 2 or 3 questions, one after another, all linked to one particular practical. And so that's something that could come up this year, and maybe chromatography could be not its own question on section A, but perhaps 3 or 4 questions in the multiple choice section. You get 50 minutes to do section B, and that works out at 1 minute and 40 seconds per question, which isn't very long, but some questions are faster than that, and so that allows you to take up to 3 marks in order to whittle those 4 options down into 2 and then pick the correct one from that. If you're running out of time, or if you've spent 3 minutes on a question already, get it down to 2 options and go for a 50-50 and then move on, because there's loads of marks up for grabs on section B. Completing section B can be a bit of a struggle, and some people do struggle with managing their time. And some people tell me that they actually start with section B, give themselves a really strict time limit, and then move on once they've reached that limit. That might not be your preferred way of doing it, but you might like to watch me doing some multiple choice questions and modelling my thinking out loud. And so I've got a number of different walkthroughs for a variety of different topics, so you could have a go at the questions yourselves and then watch me doing my thinking out loud as I work through those questions afterwards. In conclusion then, there are normally 5 or 6 questions on section A, and so my strong shouts are that one of them will be rate equation linked to one of the required practicals, another will be thermodynamics, specifically Born-Haber cycles, potentially linked to a calorimetry experiment. Then we have the equilibrium constant, Kc or Kp. I strongly suspect one of those will come up linked to another organic chemistry topic. And then I think aldehydes and ketones will have a topic, potentially linked to chemical testing. And then amines has been underrepresented this year, potentially in one big question, along with some amino acids and some chromatography too. And there is some scope to link almost any organic chemistry topic to an organic preparation, potentially by reflux or distillation. So keep that in mind when you're prioritizing your revision as well. Okay, that's the end of this video. Good luck, everybody.